I feel like so much of the messaging back then was fear-based messaging about weight gain. A lot of girls were trying to make those calories equal or even less and go more into a caloric deficit in order to maintain what they thought was a healthy weight. It's not this static measurement that we can just copy paste every day. It fluctuates day to day, week by week. What I found really cool based on my research was that, but overall heart rate is one of the primary factors that goes into how these fitness wearables estimates caloric expenditure. Heart rate actually correlates with oxygen consumption, which correlates with energy expenditure. Heart rate lags about 15 to 30 seconds behind a sudden high-intensity effort. The least accurate device was off by 93%. Let's do a little investigative journalism and wellness girl chat about calories and fitness trackers. Welcome back to Wellness Big Sis the Pod. I'm your host, Dr. Kelsy Vick, a board-certified orthopedic doctor of physical therapy and a pelvic floor physical therapist. And if you're like me, you have come from an era hyper-focused on calories and caloric expenditure. It was the only thing I used to track on MyFitnessPal back in college to make sure I didn't gain the freshman 15 or have any weight gain from being out on my own. I feel like so much of the messaging back then was fear-based messaging about weight gain when you go out on your own and are having to cook and you're a little more stressed in college and you're having to exercise on your own. You're no longer in high school sports. Like it was all fear-based messaging around keeping your calories and your energy expenditure relatively level so that you did not become a victim of the freshman 15. As a side note, I had a TA in college. I loved her. She was from Canada, and she said when she came to Texas, she was unaware of how much chips and salsa and queso was served at every meal at Tex-Mex restaurants. And so she called it the Texas 10 for her because it was so much chips and salsa and queso that she was not used to and would just devour at every meal. So she called it the Texas 10. But whatever you called it, I feel like calories were such a focus. And back when I was in college, Fitbit was like the big thing. So I would always see what my caloric expenditure was on Fitbit and compare that with my MyFitnessPal. And this was not a healthy way to do it at all, but it was what was common at the time. A lot of girls were using MyFitnessPal and Fitbit and trying to make those calories equal or even less and go more into a caloric deficit in order to maintain what they thought was a healthy weight or a healthy body composition for this new stage in our lives. So I thought it would be fun to actually look at how different fitness trackers, common fitness trackers today, actually look at and calculate caloric expenditure. I know Apple has Move Calories, Whoop has Strain. So today we'll dive into some of the context into how different fitness trackers actually estimate caloric expenditure, and it's not the same across the board. They use different algorithms and different formulas to get caloric expenditure. We're going to talk about why it differs so drastically compared to what's actually happening within our bodies, and why we shouldn't use calories as measured on a fitness tracker as the primary objective measure that we're looking at, especially as it pertains to workout effectiveness, effort of the workout, or weight loss. So I know there are so many fitness wearables out there. The ones we'll talk about today are the common ones, I would say today: Oura Ring, Whoop, Apple Watch, Garmin, and Fitbit, which I don't see as many Fitbits nowadays, but I still figured since it was kind of the OG one that I feel like a lot of people knew, I'd still put it in there just in case someone was curious on how their old Fitbit and how some of the newer Fitbit models track caloric expenditure compared to more popular fitness wearables today. So let's go over a few basics, starting with what even is a calorie. So a calorie with a big C is the energy to heat 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius at standard pressure, which equals about 4.184 joules. Such a complicated definition for what a calorie is. In food labeling and nutrition labeling, when we talk about a calorie with a little c, what we're really referring to are kilocalories. And kilocalories represent the energy your body gets from oxidizing nutrients like carbs, proteins, and fats. For example, a 250 calorie item on a label means 250 kilocalories or 250,000 small calories. Now, what are the basics behind how fitness trackers actually measure calories? So every fitness tracker estimates the total daily energy expenditure using two variables. And remember, energy expenditure is a fancy term for calories expended because calories is a unit used to measure energy. So, those two variables that go into total daily energy expenditure are your basal metabolic rate, the calories required to sustain basic life functions at rest, basically breathing, digestion, circulation, cellular repair, which typically accounts for about 60 to 75% of daily calorie burn. And the second variable is active energy expenditure. So the additional calories burned through physical activity and movement, from walking around the house to intense exercise. What fitness trackers don't actually track that also goes into our physiologic total daily energy expenditure are what we call thermic effect of food and non exercise activity thermogenesis. So, the thermic effect of food accounts for about 10% of daily caloric energy expenditure, and it's the amount of calories used to just digest the food that we're consuming. And then NEAT, or non exercise activity thermogenesis, includes fidgeting, gesturing while talking. This is actually really cool. There's studies done on even like a soleus raise, so like when you're sitting and just lifting your heel up, and how many extra calories that burns for people who are just fidgeters, naturally fidgeting. So the fidgeting, the hand gesturing, all of that goes into this NEAT, or non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which fitness trackers do not track. It's a lot harder to track hand gestures and movements and little fidgets throughout the day with something you wear on your wrist or your finger. So that makes sense, but those are the two variables that fitness trackers don't accurately estimate or include into their calculations for total energy expenditure. So BMR, or basal metabolic rate, most fitness trackers estimate this from a few well-known equations based on your age, sex, height, and weight. So a lot of the time when you're setting up an account, this is what you will enter, and this helps to estimate your BMR. And there's a few standard equations. There's differences amongst all of them, but there's a few, I guess, well-known equations that estimate BMR based on the variables that you enter when you create your account on these fitness trackers. However, even these equations have their own drawbacks, oftentimes citing high accuracy for the given value of your BMR within about 200 calories plus or minus. So there's a high amount of accuracy within a 200 plus or minus calories of what you're actually expending each day. So the formulas that help estimate BMR that are a part of these fitness trackers already have some limitations to them. So a few drawbacks for some of these equations that these fitness trackers use is, number one, it's a static equation. Our BMR is affected by a lot of different factors, things like our hormones, our sleep, our stress, our environmental temperatures. So it's not this static measurement that we can just copy paste every day. It fluctuates day to day, week by week. It's not this static measurement. So that's one of the drawbacks of these equations. And another drawback is that the studies that have been used to come up with these equations aren't inclusive of all variations in our genetics. So these formulas basically already have their limitations, and these fitness trackers are using these formulas, which are researched and are the best ones when it comes to what has been researched. But since they're already using these to get your BMR, you're already starting from this limited viewpoint of your actual caloric expenditure. So the second variable that fitness trackers track when it comes to total daily energy expenditure is your active energy expenditure. So this is that movement on top of what is required to sustain basic life. So active calorie estimates are really the bread and butter of these fitness trackers, and they are very secretive on what their algorithms are because that's usually the R&D that has gone into creating some of the best algorithms for their fitness trackers based on the sensors involved and based on the data that they have from all of us as fitness wearable consumers. So it's very secretive, but there's a few tools that a lot of these fitness trackers use to help estimate active energy expenditure. Most of them use a combination of an accelerometer, which is movement and velocity changes. So this is something like step count. They oftentimes use an optical heart rate sensor. So this is that like red flashing light that picks up heart rate via light absorption. Some of them have a gyroscope or a tracker sensor for rotational movements, especially used in activity classifications like swimming or different rotational movements of the arm, especially a lot of the time the trackers are primarily wrist-based, or if it's the Oura ring, it is finger-based. So different rotational movements sensed via the arm typically. A barometer, which helps detect incline decline, a GPS, GNSS, geolocation, outdoor pace and distance estimator, and then skin temperature. So general metabolic state, and this one's primarily used by Oura. So these are all of the different sensors that fitness trackers can utilize to estimate total daily energy expenditure or caloric expenditure. And these aren't all included in all sensors, but these are just sort of the basic categories of sensors that are integrated into fitness wearables. What I found really cool based on my research was that the reason they have you choose different activity levels whenever you're recording a workout is because their algorithms will switch to different sensors and prioritize those sensors or the data coming from those sensors more than data coming from other sensors based on the activity that you're doing. So if you're doing something like swimming, they're going to use the data coming from the gyroscope more or weight that heavier than the data coming from the barometer or the incline declines. So if you think about it, it makes sense to weight certain data a little bit higher based on the activity that you're doing. So this might be why some of those caloric estimates change once you change your activity after the fact. So if you just start exercising without actually going in the app, or going on your watch, changing the activity that you're doing, and then performing the workout and then stopping the workout, if you go in after the fact, this is why some of those estimates might change, is because their algorithms pull or weight certain data heavier based on the activity that you're doing, which I thought was actually pretty cool. It makes sense, but once I realized, like, oh yeah, of course they're getting this data from so many different sensors, and it makes sense to weight data coming from the gyroscope for swimming higher than step count data, of course. So I thought that was pretty cool. But overall, heart rate is typically the primary driver of caloric expenditure across all models. They will weight other data a little more depending on the activity, but overall, heart rate is one of the primary factors that goes into how these fitness wearables and how this fitness tech estimates caloric expenditure. So why is that? Heart rate actually correlates with oxygen consumption, which correlates with energy expenditure. And there's a formula for this, although the formula is said to be more accurate at greater than 50% of your max heart rate. So again, another estimation formula that has error built in that will affect the accuracy of the caloric data that these fitness wearables are giving you. So oxygen consumption, or VO2, is a measure of how much oxygen your muscles can actually utilize, not necessarily how much oxygen they're receiving, but how efficient are your muscles at actually utilizing the oxygen that is sent to them. It goes a step further and takes into account things like mitochondrial density and how much your muscles can actually utilize the oxygen at more of a cellular level. And there's a lot of formulas that can look at heart rate and estimate your VO2. And many of the fitness trackers use a variation of this relationship in order to estimate caloric expenditure. But before we dive into that, let's talk about the gold standard way of measuring your VO2 max so that we know how these fitness trackers are getting the estimate compared to that gold standard testing in the lab. So to measure VO2, you typically are using a treadmill or a cycle, like a stationary bike, depending on the activity that you perform most often. A lot of the time they're doing these in elite athletes, and so specificity is very important, but we'll use the treadmill as an example. You'll put a mask on, and it's a very uncomfortable mask that is tied up to a lot of different sensors to measure and estimate different gas concentrations of O2 and CO2. So what you'll do is you'll start running on a treadmill, and over time, the treadmill will increase in incline and speed. So you're basically ramping up intensity really quickly. It's usually a pretty quick test because your goal is to reach this relative fatigue point or a certain ratio of O2 to CO2 before the test is actually terminated. So you put the mask on, you run on the treadmill. The mask starts measuring different gas concentrations, primarily CO2 as it's expelled. As intensity increases, your heart rate rises. You consume more O2 and expel more CO2. At some point, the intensity of the workout will exceed the amount of oxygen that your heart and lungs can supply. So CO2 will continue to increase as you're expelling air, as you're exhaling, and O2 plateaus. So that test is terminated once that O2 plateaus, but that's ideal. It also might terminate if the intensity gets too high for the testing subject, or if that O2 CO2 ratio reaches a certain number and then the test is terminated. So it's a very challenging test. It requires a good amount of lab gear, a good amount of sensors. So a lot of the time we just try and estimate VO2 based on some of these formulas. And just to link it back to this entire episode, VO2 and heart rate are linked together, and both of those variables, along with certain Other variables and data coming from other sensors are utilized to estimate caloric expenditure in these fitness wearables. Okay, let's dive in to each of the different fitness wearables. And if you guys have one that I didn't mention, I know Microsoft has one, I know Samsung has one. I'm sorry I haven't gotten to these, but I feel like a lot of them have similar technologies and ways of calculating, but I'd be happy to do another bonus episode of just those devices. If you guys tell me which ones you utilize, I haven't seen too many of my own friends using like the Samsung or the Microsoft, or I know I keep getting ads for the new earrings, so I'm interested to see that one. I don't think it's out yet, but if you guys have any other ones that you'd like me to dive into, I'd be more than happy to. But today we'll just cover Apple Watch, Garmin, Oura Ring, Whoop, and the Fitbit. Starting with the Apple Watch. So some of the key features. Move calories on the Apple Watch looks just at active energy expenditure. So remember, there's the BMR, basal metabolic rate, and then there's active energy expenditure. And these move calories on your Apple Watch constitute the active energy expenditure. Total calories combines BMR and active energy expenditure. And the Apple Watch has a VO2 integration. So it's different from calories, but it gives a good picture of overall heart health. So the VO2 feature specifically has been found to be accurate within 4% of the actual value of your actual VO2 if you're using that VO2 integration. So I think you actually have to go in and do the VO2 testing in order to get that more accurate within 4% estimate. But that's super cool. So the Apple Watch basics, it uses the heart rate, the optical heart rate sensor. It uses the accelerometer, the gyroscope, the barometer, and GPS data. It also has activity-based individualization. So it uses machine learning-based activity classification to better estimate caloric expenditure based on activity-specific formulas. So it weights data coming from the accelerometer, the gyroscope, GPS data, etc., based on that activity. So super important if you want the most accurate estimate to actually start your workout for most of these fitness wearables with the workout that you're actually doing. That way it can weight some of the data a little bit more appropriately for the activity that you're doing. So if you're swimming, it will weight data coming from gyroscope a little higher, GPS and accelerometer will be weighted higher for walking and running, and then yoga, Pilates, etc. with heart rate weighted a little bit more. For the Whoop, the key features, it notably rejects step counts entirely in favor of a strain model, which integrates continuous heart rate monitoring. That's a big thing for Whoop, continuous heart rate monitoring. BMR calculations based on height, age, weight, and sex, and this is how all of them get their BMR calculations. Whoop claims their product doesn't count steps, because step count ignores intensity and other movements, with their preferred method being strain, which accounts for heart rate alongside physical activity. So to calculate the active energy expenditure for Whoop, they utilize your heart rate to estimate strain data and therefore active caloric expenditure. They utilize heart rate reserve, which is max heart rate minus your resting heart rate, to gauge intensity in activity and when to switch algorithms to measure caloric expenditure. So once it goes higher than about 30% of your heart rate reserve, which is your max heart rate minus your resting heart rate, then it will switch algorithms to be more of an active exercise-based algorithm to calculate that active energy expenditure. And just as a reminder, we've done an episode on max heart rate and resting heart rate, but max heart rate is typically estimated, again, there's a few formulas for this, but it's estimated to be 220 minus your age is your max heart rate. So intensity is based on a percentage of that max heart rate. It's definitely affected by heart rate medications, blood pressure medications, any cardiovascular medications. So that's a little disclaimer. But if you're a normal, healthy adult, you can use 220 minus age to estimate your max heart rate. And then your resting heart rate is typically the lowest heart rate that your body reaches at rest. And heart rate reserve is the max heart rate minus your resting heart rate. So Whoop will start calculating active energy expenditure at 30% of that heart rate reserve number. For the Oura Ring, key features, it utilizes the gyroscope, accelerometer, heart rate sensing, body temp, and then user-entered body metrics, again, specifically for that basal metabolic rate. So it's worn on the finger rather than the wrist, giving it better heart rate sensing from what Oura says. I still question this because when we take pulse metrics, we're taking it at the wrist. So I question this a little bit, but I do agree with them saying the fingers might move a little bit less. So the data that they're getting from the finger might be a little bit more accurate because you're not necessarily having some of these hand gestures at the wrist. Your fingers are typically not moving as much as your wrist. So I can see that a little bit, but we definitely take pulse measurements and heart rate measurements at the wrist. So I question those claims a little bit. And if anyone has some of the science to back that up, I would love to read it, but I still question the claim that the finger has better blood flow than the wrists. The Oura ring emphasizes passive resting metrics and uses a combination of finger heart rate sensing, temperature, and accelerometer to estimate calorie expenditure. So passive calories, or that BMR, is derived from user-entered body metrics, body temp, and sleep pattern. So this takes a more holistic approach to estimate BMR. As we said earlier, some of those BMR formulas do not take into account stress and sleep and some of the dynamics of your BMR. They use it as more of a static measurement. So Oura tries to account for that with some of its sleep technology sensing and body temp sensing, although we'll talk about it later, that technology isn't quite accurate either. So take all of that with a grain of salt, but at least they're trying to integrate some of those more holistic components into your BMR into some of their measurements. For active calories, it uses METs to classify activities as low, moderate, or high intensity. So a MET is kind of a confusing thing. I think it's meant to be simple, but to me it's confusing, but it's a metabolic equivalent. So METs are used as a multiplier of your BMR. So one MET is the energy required to sustain you at rest. So if something is 3 METs, it's 3 times as intense as at rest. If it's 5 METs, it's 5 times as intense. So it's a multiplier. I think it's a little bit more confusing. I have never really used it, but I also understand that in order to gauge intensity, they can use it as a multiplier based on low effort, moderate effort, or high intensity effort. And I have used an Oura ring, and after the workout, it'll say what is your intensity effort. And this is why, is because they will use a multiplier for low intensity, moderate intensity, and high intensity to calculate your caloric expenditure for that workout. However, if it's a highly intense upper body day, I have found that if I put high intensity, I don't necessarily think that I burned as many calories that the Oura ring says. So I feel like there is some definitely subjectivity to that measurement based on your own gauge of intensity. So the fact that you're the one deciding whether that workout was low, moderate, or high intensity to then calculate the active energy expenditure, there's a little bit of a limitation in that calculation then. So basically, your intensity ranking then helps them to calculate the estimated caloric expenditure. For Garmin, some of the key features, it uses GPS when available to supplement accelerometer data for outdoor activities and incorporates VO2 max estimates, which it calculates from heart rate versus that pace data to improve calorie estimates for trained athletes specifically. So it gets those VO2 max estimates from heart rate and running pace or cycling power. If your heart rate is lower at a given pace, they assume higher aerobic fitness. So they're taking your pace. If you've got a relatively quick pace and your heart rate is a little bit lower of your max heart rate, they assume your VO2 max based on that data that they're collecting and then can use that to help estimate total active caloric expenditure or energy expenditure. So because of this integrated GPS data, you can actually estimate your VO2 that you're working at during a workout. So once Garmin actually has that VO2 max estimate based on your heart rate at a certain pace, it can then calculate how much oxygen you're consuming at a given heart rate. So this relationship is pretty linear above 50%. They also reference pace data to help layer that into the equation to make it a little bit more, or try and make it a little bit more accurate. In general, 1 liter of oxygen consumed is estimated to take about 5 kilocalories of energy. It's a little different depending on the fuel source, so whether fats or carbs, but they estimate it to be about 5 kilocalories of energy. So once VO2 max is established as a ceiling, the current VO2 that you're working at is estimated by seeing where your real-time heart rate falls relative to your heart rate reserve, which again is that heart rate max minus heart rate rest. So the VO2 max is your ceiling. Heart rate during the workout tells you at what fraction of that ceiling you're working at. And since we have that formula of 1 liter of oxygen consumed is estimated to be about 5 kilocalories of energy, we can convert some of that VO2 data, some of that heart rate data to then get total active energy expenditure. So for cycling, it's a little bit different. It switches the algorithm to estimate direct power output rather than heart rate. So it's more accurate, especially if it's actually connected to a direct power meter. So there's a wide range in accuracy for Garmin. One study says they found accuracy within 7% of lab measurements for calories specifically, with some as low as 6.7% during medium to high effort activities. So that's the bottom part of the range. Another study reported up to 49.3% error with the use of what they call this first beat technology, which is a company that Garmin acquired to put this energy expenditure data into their products. Overall, Garmin seems to underestimate at lower and higher intensities for your caloric expenditure. At lower intensities of effort, say yoga or an upper body day, your heart rate, which is a key measurement in the Garmin active energy expenditure formula, won't elevate despite the high amount of muscular effort that your body's putting in, which would then underestimate calories. And then at the higher intensities, like during high intensity interval training or sprints, we are reaching about 80 to 100% of our max heart rate, depending on the workout. But the energy system within our bodies that we utilize during all-out sprints is our anaerobic system, or a system that doesn't utilize oxygen. Heart rate lags about 15 to 30 seconds behind a sudden high-intensity effort because the cardiovascular system takes time to ramp up. And during that window, the muscles are already working anaerobically, so without oxygen, at near maximal output. So since the algorithm utilizes oxygen consumption as a factor for deciding caloric expenditure and takes into account heart rate, it would underestimate caloric expenditure at these higher intensities due to the use of our anaerobic systems and that heart rate lag. Overall, Garmin is more accurate for people using GPS because it gives the pace data that helps in the VO2 estimate equation. For the Fitbit, some of the key features are it uses accelerometer and heart rate sensing if the device has a heart rate sensor. Older models typically rely a little bit more on accelerometer data over the heart rate, and newer models with heart rate sensors now utilize that heart rate data a little bit more. So some of the studies that looked at a wide variety of fitness trackers, what do they say when it comes to caloric expenditure and how accurate these fitness trackers are at measuring total daily energy expenditure with that BMR and those active energy expenditure part of the equation? So overall, devices over or underestimate energy expenditure by greater than 30% on average. And the error exceeds the 10% acceptable threshold for all devices in real-world conditions. So there was a Stanford benchmark study in 2017, and the two devices, they looked at, I think, 6 or 7 devices, but not all of them were either around or talked about, like the Oura Ring wasn't included, the Garmin wasn't included. They did include the Apple Watch and the Fitbit Surge, which were part of our investigative journalism, but the most accurate device was off by an average of 27% when comparing how it estimated total daily energy expenditure and then also what was found in the lab. The least accurate device was off by 93%. Factors including skin color and BMI affected those measurements. There's a 2025 head-to-head comparison done that looked at some of the more modern fitness trackers compared to lab testing. So they looked at some of the results as a percentage of actual lab-measured calorie burn. So Whoop was 66% of the actual calorie burn, so it underestimated by about 34%. Fitbit Charge was 72%, so it underestimated it by about 28%. The Samsung Galaxy Watch was about 78%. Oura Ring 4 was about 86%, and Apple Watch Series 10, 92%, which is the closest to the lab result, underestimating it by only about 8%. And then the Garmin Vivo Active 6 was 112%. So it actually overestimated caloric expenditure by about 12%. So then there was a systematic review done that looked at 158 publications covering 9 brands of fitness wearables. And among the studies, no brand fell within the acceptable accuracy limits for energy expenditure. There was an overall tendency to underestimate the energy expenditure, and only about 18% of the comparisons fell within plus or minus that 10% error. 53% fell below that 10% error. So the bottom line, the metric resting heart rate has excellent accuracy for these fitness wearables, about 2 to 5% error. Step count is pretty good, 8 to 10% error. Heart rate variability is good for trends, but it varies by device. Calorie expenditure is poor, 27 to 93% error range across various studies and across various devices. Sleep duration had moderate accuracy, often greater than 10% overestimation, and sleep staging was pretty weak, about 79% accuracy at best. So what does all this mean? What I found very interesting was the algorithm switching with different activities. I should have probably assumed that based on especially the Oura Ring, where if I did a strength training day and it was an upper body strength training day and I put high intensity compared to low intensity or moderate intensity, it definitely changed that caloric expenditure variable that was going into that equation a little bit more. So I thought that was interesting in how they pull from different data from these different sensors and weight different data a little heavier depending on the activity, which I think is kind of cool. But how would I recommend to use calories? Like, why are we even tracking them on these fitness trackers if the accuracy is relatively low across a lot of studies? I think we're probably getting closer and closer, and I think that's probably the goal. But if your goal is something like understanding intensity of your workout or looking into different trends of your workouts mixed with your activity level throughout the day, even just walking. I think calories can give you a good trend, but I wouldn't necessarily look at it and use it as a way to base your dietary modifications on if you're trying to go more into a caloric deficit or a caloric surplus. Again, there's high amounts of error in these calculations, in these estimations, in these formulas that these fitness wearables are using based on the research. There's error at every step, which only compounds the amount of error in that final answer. So I wouldn't necessarily use it as this objective data to base any changes in my nutritional patterns or exercise patterns off of, but I think if we look at trends, it might be a nice way to have just another variable to track. Overall, I feel like calories is not something I look at or rely heavily on for data. I like to use heart rate or VO2 or my heart rate variability, like how I recover, my VO2 max. I like to use some of those variables to gauge certain performance improvements and training improvements. So I don't necessarily like to use calories. That's not saying that you shouldn't, but this just gives a little bit of a rundown, a little bit of the science behind how different fitness trackers are calculating calories and the accuracy amongst them. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. This was a fun little investigative journalism episode again. I hope you learned a little bit about caloric expenditure, how calories are counted, how the different formulas involved in estimating caloric expenditure and your basal metabolic rate and metabolic equivalents. That might be something new for you guys too. And a reminder on VO2, like we got to incorporate a lot of fun exercise physiology stuff in today's episode, but I hope you guys learned a lot. I hope you're able to bring this up in conversation with some of your friends who are like, oh, my move calories are at this. And you'll be like, hang on, that's cool. But maybe look at this variable instead, given the inaccuracy in some of these fitness trackers and their ability to count calories. So maybe a fun conversation topic to bring up with your other health and wellnessy friends. But I enjoyed this look into fitness trackers and caloric expenditure. I hope you guys learned a lot, and I'll see you guys again on the next episode of Wellness Big Sis the Pod.